The Odyssey is one of the greatest stories ever told. But what if I told you it was built on real history? I'm Curtis Holland, and I'm an independent historian who looks at ancient history, ancient texts, and ancient symbolism through a scientific and first principles lens. And today, we're going to talk about Homer, the Odyssey, his epic poetry, and what the ancient historians thought about mythology. So before we get into it, let me set the stage. Up until the late 19th century, the academic consensus was Troy was a myth, a fictional city that never existed outside the page. And then, during the archaeological boom in the late 19th century, a man named Heinrich Schliemann decided to finally put shovel to dirt in Turkey. Or dynamite to dirt might be more apropos. Regardless, he took Homer seriously. He started excavation work at a site called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, and there he found a Bronze Age citadel, layered through 9 layers of occupation, one built on top of the ruins of the last. One of those layers, a layer we call Layer 7A, was destroyed in a fire around 1180 BC. And while some scholars may have questioned his motivations, and his excavation methods may be primitive by today's standards, we cannot argue with his results. Schliemann had done it. Later archaeological evidence and further excavation would conclude that this was indeed the mythological city of Troy. It's in textbooks now. It's taught in classics and history courses. That's not alternative theory. That's the standard model of history applied to a primary source, with a result you can literally stand on. The formal identification is Walusa, a late Bronze Age city that had become a vassal state of the Hittites in the latter half of the late Bronze Age. So then that raises a good question. What is myth? You see, myth isn't fantasy, but it's not exactly history either. Instead, myth sits somewhere in between. And the cleanest way I can put it is this. Myth is compressed memory, a collection of sacred foundational stories shared by a culture to explain the origins of their world, natural phenomenon, and human nature. You see, these stories get mythologized as memory fades, but they're usually built on top of real history. So then, who was Homer? And that's actually a really good question with a really nuanced response. The true answer is we don't exactly know. Our best guess is Homer was a blind poet who lived sometime in the 8th century BC, reciting his epic poetry to all of the people of Greece. What we do know is he was credited with the penning of the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as several other major influential works. And more to that, he functions as the backbone for the ideology of most of classical Greece, referenced by historians like Herodotus, Diodorus, and Strabo. Some of his works have been lost to time. We do not have them, but we do have a large selection of Homeric hymns. Regardless of whether or not this was one man or a collection of authors, his works influenced the world for thousands of years. So the first real question is, what world is Homer actually describing? And it's not the Greece you're picturing. It's not the white columns and the philosophers and the democracy. It's Mycenaean Greece, and it's a different world entirely. This is a world of grandiose palaces at Pylos, at Mycenae, at Tiryns, a world with its own writing system, Linear B, that isn't even the same script the Greeks would later use. Centralized kingdoms, organized trade, professional warfare, no democracy, no modern law codes, just kings and royal families. More Game of Thrones than your 300 Spartans. And it didn't stand alone. It was one node in a connected Bronze Age world. The Hittites in Anatolia, New Kingdom Egypt under Ramses the Great, and the Middle Assyrian Empire, all connected in this vast international trade network that made the wealth of the Bronze Age possible. And then, around 1200 BC, right in our time window, everything collapses. Within about 50 years, nearly every palatial civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean burns, fails, or is simply abandoned. The trade routes go dark. The notorious sea peoples invade and ravage the coastlines. And in Greece, writing itself is lost for some 400 years. Nobody's keeping records because nobody's reading them. And that entire administrative world just goes silent. We call this stretch the Greek Dark Ages, from around 1200 BC down to about 750 BC, no alphabets, no documents, nothing written. only what people could carry in their heads and say aloud. And then around 750 BC, through Phoenician trade, the Greek alphabet is developed and Homer is finally written down. So consider what that means. By the time Homer is written down, the world he describes is fundamentally alien to the Greeks who are listeners. They can understand the gravity of the legend, but they no longer understand the reality within it. That's mythic compression at work. And that's the part that people skip past. Because when Homer composed these poems, he wasn't writing. He couldn't write. The system was gone. This was oral poetry, an art form you trained for, and Homer was the master at it. So he wrapped it in gods and monsters and the whole mythic register. That's how you make a story survive 400 years without paper. And that's what made it exciting and engaging to the listener. That's not decoration, that's the storage medium. But underneath all that, and this is the whole game, Homer embedded real things, real kings, real cities, real people, real places, scattered across the whole Mediterranean, carried intact across 4 centuries inside the meter of a poem. And we're not the first people to even notice that. In fact, most of the ancient historians operated that way as a default. One such historian was Strabo. Strabo was a Greek-Roman scholar who actually traveled the empire, who went to the places he wrote about and saw them with his own eyes. He left us 17 books on geography, but more than that, when modern scholars need a source on antiquity, on a location, Strabo is their go-to. He was not a fringe figure by any means, and he is often the source of our own knowledge. But of all 17 books written by Strabo, the one that is least read is his first book, the one where he lays out his methodology. And in that chapter, he opens his entire body of work by arguing that Homer founded geography. Now let's sit with that for a second. One of the single most cited ancient historians of all time for modern history and archaeology said Homer was the founder of geography. Not Homer was mentioned in some places, founded it. The word he uses, archēgetēs, literally means first ancestor or founder, the start of the entire discipline. He even goes so far as to say that Homer knew the world was a sphere by deducing how the ships would appear over the horizon. He said he knew the peoples within it and at the edges of it. He knew the shape of the Mediterranean, and he knew of many of the events that transpired in the past. And so Strabo, as one of the most cited geographers of all time, traces everything he does back to Homer. But let no scholar go unchallenged. Strabo had to defend his position as it was not universally agreed upon at the time. Another major scholar, Eratosthenes, the man who literally measured the circumference of the earth, took an opposing view. He said the poet aims at only one thing, psychagogia. Psychagogia is leading the soul, it's entertainment, not what would be the equivalent didascalia, which is teaching or educating. In other words, Homer's here to tell you a good story. Don't look too much into it. And Strabo spends the greater portion of his first book systematically dismantling that argument. His core idea is that the first Greeks called poetry the first philosophy, the original vehicle for serious knowledge, the thing they used to teach their children, not just to entertain them or amuse them, but to educate them, to shape them in their life. And Plato echoes this exact sentiment in his magnum opus, Laws. And Strabo also catches Eratosthenes contradicting himself. You see, earlier in his works, Eratosthenes had praised Homer. He remarks that Homer did an excellent job in accurately depicting various people groups around Africa. The Ethiopians, the Egyptians, the Libyans, and he had recorded these with tremendous accuracy. But then a short while later, he turns around and says that all poetry is just entertainment. So Strabo basically asked, is the man who shared that level of detail and understanding, is he solely trying to entertain you? Or is he teaching you something as well? Strabo's whole point is this: you can't understand the world, let alone teach it coherently, without having a high degree of foundational knowledge of the subject matter. His literal words, who could lay out the differences between places and teach them all well without having thought about or learned any of this? And then he continues and says, look at how the poets draw their heroes. The wisest ones are always the ones who traveled, who saw many men's cities and learned their minds. To the ancients, knowing the world was the mark of a sharp mind. It wasn't just storytellers' flourish, it was a sign of high intelligence. But Strabo takes it one step further that echoes the modern understanding of how the human mind works. He argues plainly that intellectual prose came from poetry, not the other way around. Verse came first. It was the original container for organized knowledge, and prose is merely the later form. Think about what that means. We assume the serious stuff lives only in dry prose and poetry is the decoration. And Strabo is telling you that's backwards. The meter came first, because the meter is how you carry knowledge when there is no writing. And once you seriously consider that, it's functionally obvious. Why would a culture put most of its information into a verse? Why rhyme? Why rhythm? Why meter? And it's for this reason. Meter is self-correcting. When you memorize something in a strict meter, the wrong word breaks a line. The rhythm itself tells you when something's been corrupted. It's a self-checking format. It's a method against error. And this is exactly what the Hindu Vedas do, an enormous body of sacred, technical knowledge preserved orally, by sound, by meter, and by rule. And it had been preserved for thousands of years before anyone had written it down. Same problem, same solution, different corner of the world. Australian Aboriginal history accurately preserves memories back almost 50,000 years and is continuously validated as our understanding of the past improves with our technological capabilities. It's the same reason you can easily remember the words to your favorite song, yet you go to class and you forget the lecture an hour after it happened. But we know this method isn't constrained to Homer. There was another author, Apollonius of Rhodes, who wrote the Argonautica, the voyage of Jason going after the Golden Fleece. A lot of us know that story from the old 1960 movie with all the stop-motion animation that we used to watch in elementary school. Apollonius of Rhodes was one of the first head librarians at the Library of Alexandria. He had access to all of the institutional records, all of the knowledge contained therein. The records of Egypt, Greece, the Persians, and the Near Eastern empires, all sitting in that library. And what does he do with it? He builds a mythology regarding a journey around the world, anchored to real places. And while Apollonius had no need to lock his story in poetry in the way Homer did, they're both going after the same thing, preserving history through mythology. And so if we're going to look at myths and use them to anchor real history, this question always arises. Did the ancient authors believe in these myths? Did they truly believe in the fantastical elements such as magic, witches, cyclops, and monsters? For the ancient historians, the answer is a definitive no. And this is something many people tend to get wrong about the ancient world. They weren't all believing in fairy tales. In fact, many of them go out of their way to make that point explicit. Herodotus, often called the first historian, said it like this. He traveled the known world, and where he did, he heard stories, and what he would say is, I'll transmit what I have heard faithfully as I can, but that does not mean that I'm required to believe it. Thucydides, another ancient author, makes a point to literally cut all myth out of his history intentionally. And he notes the trade-off, that it, quote-unquote, made for a duller read, but a more useful one. And Plutarch, a later Roman historian, spent his entire career trying to divorce myth from history. And then there's Diodorus Siculus. Diodorus worked in the Library of Alexandria for 30 years, amongst a team of researchers during the pinnacle of the Roman Republic, right before Caesar became emperor. His job was to write a universal history of the known world. And so again, here's where first principles comes into play. He anchors the entire project to the Trojan War. His date for the fall of Troy is diagnostic, 1184 BC. Our modern accepted historical date based on radiocarbon dating is 1180. Radiocarbon dating has error, and Diodorus is working from known institutional records. And what makes this interesting is that he doesn't even litigate it. It's just accepted. In fact, most ancient historians anchor the start of their timeline to the Trojan War. So think about that for a moment. Diodorus has access to one of the world's largest libraries during the time of the Romans, who were one of the most powerful civilizations in modern history. 30 years in the greatest archive of the ancient world, alongside a team of Greeks, Egyptian priests, Roman researchers, with ample resources behind him. And the Trojan War was the foundation point of the whole project. These are some of the sharpest minds the world has ever produced. Their works last thousands of years and anchor how we build our own history and our own knowledge. And here they are, reading these myths, trying to extract the kernels of information that tell them about their past, just like we do, trying to figure out ours. Hey, thanks for watching this video. This is a long one, so this is part one. The next part I'll be discussing in more detail the specifics of the Odyssey, the journey of Odysseus, where he travels, what those locations entail, and whether or not we can actually find something that may have been forgotten. I'm Curtis Holland, and I'll see you on the next one.